Let's look at an obscure version of the British 1796 light cavalry sabre. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and this is part of my obscure weapons playlist. Check that out if you haven't done already. Now, what I'm holding here is a 1796 light cavalry sabre. You've actually seen this one, hopefully previously, in another video or two of mine. This is unusual in that this is really massive. This is a giant version of a British 1796 light cavalry sabre. This was used by both cavalry troopers, that is private soldiers, and officers. Officers purchased their own swords, they were privately purchased. Troopers' weapons, troopers' swords, much like modern military rifles, were owned by the military, the regiment back then, and they were provided to the troopers. However, they followed a basic pattern. Now, clearly this one didn't, because this is a giant one. This isn't actually what this video is about, this particular sword. We're going to see that sword in a second. However, whilst this sword was hugely popular, and not only was popular in the past, but is hugely popular today, it's one of the best-selling and most sought-after models of sword. Even people that don't particularly collect British military swords seem to want a 1796 light cavalry sabre. This was a popular sword in its time, still is today, but nevertheless there were some people who just weren't happy with it. Now, two of the main criticisms aimed at this model of sword was that, number one, it wasn't particularly good at thrusting because of the curvature of the blade and the style of so-called hatchet point. You'll notice the hatchet point places the point at the back blunt spine of the blade here. So those two things coupled, the curvature and the placement of the point, mean that it's not particularly good for stabbing, thrusting, or as they would have referred to it at the time, giving point. And of course, remember, this is primarily a cavalry sword. So indeed, whilst you can, in theory, do curved thrusts of various sort from above and below and around here that do indeed, you know, stab with the point. You can stab with any pointy piece of metal at the end of the day. Because of the curvature and because of the placement of the point towards the back spine of the blade, you've got to admit it is not really well set up for thrusting if that's primarily what you want to do, particularly from horseback, because remember, of course, that on horseback, a horse is travelling in a pretty much straight line relative to the target. So in terms of just holding the sword out, because remember, you don't stab physically with your arm when you're on horseback, you hold the weapon out and let the speed of the horse deliver the point. In that situation, this sword is particularly badly set up for that. Incidentally, the other thing that this was criticised for was a lack of hand protection. Now, you could argue, does it really need it? Swords like the Russian Shashka and various other types of, you know, Hungarian and Polish sabres don't have very much hand protection on them either. And if you're moving past an opponent on horseback and laying your blade across them, or point, as may be the case, and riding on, you're not standing and duking it out on horseback, so you don't necessarily need a lot of hand protection. That being said, a bit of extra hand protection, so long as it doesn't come at a big deficit of adding lots of weight or whatever, is always sought after, because there will be times when you do just get hit in the hand rather than parrying with the blade or whatever. And sometimes, despite the fact you're on a horse, sometimes you will get stuck up in more of a static kind of melee situation where the horses are all moving around each other and it's a big old mess. This certainly happened, for example, in the charge of the Light Brigade and the charge of the Heavy Brigade during the Crimean Wars, and it happened several times during the Peninsular Wars in the Napoleonic period as well. So, a bit of extra hand protection would be appreciated on this model of sword, and some way of making it better at thrusting. So, before we move into ways that was, at least the thrusting, we're going to focus on the point in this video. Before we move on, I do just want to say that there were later models of sword which sought to solve the hand protection issue by adding extra hand protection, adding extra bars on here. And of course, the next model of sword which replaced the 1796 light cavalry sabre, which was the 1821 pattern light cavalry sabre, has a straighter blade, a spear point, and has a 3-bar guard. Now, interestingly, the reason I'm holding this particular sword is this is an Indian cavalry sword, which has a blade very much inspired by the 1796 light cavalry saber blade, but this is much later. This is Victorian, okay, so this is kind of mid-Victorian in date, maybe about 1860, and you'll notice that it has a 3-bar guard. Now, why did, in an age when most people had gone to straighter blades with a better thrusting point, why did they retain this in India? Quite simply because Indian cavalry, Sowars as they were called, they were Indian cavalry troopers, they were used to using talwars and other curved swords. So they preferred a curved blade, and indeed there are plenty of Indian swords around which reused 1796 light cavalry saber blades. They really, really liked them. They thought they were good quality, well made, well tempered, kept a good edge, and they were springy and reliable, and so they mounted them on native Indian hilts quite often. Okay, so they loved that type of blade, so the British officers and the British command, the India office, and the various Indian presidencies, as they were called, Bengal, Bombay and Madras, they went, well, you know, if that's the type of blade they like to use, leave them with that type of blade, but let's give them a bit more hand protection, so they added those 3 bars on. Now, coming back to the thrusting point, British cavalry, and you could say European cavalry in general, however, they wanted them to use the point more. So there were various attempts to introduce swords that were compromised cut and thrust blades. And these succeeded or failed to varying degrees. However, I think we can say that most of the 19th century and actually into the beginning of the 20th century, really what we find is compromised blades. Blades that can cut pretty well and can thrust pretty well. At the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, we see various militaries, the British, the French, the Swedish, for example, the Americans, go towards more thrusting blades for cavalry. But that's something we've dealt with in other videos, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in other future videos. But in the age of the Napoleonic curved 1796 saber, there were some people who, despite that being the regulation sword, sought to create models of sword which were better adapted for thrusting. Now, one of the most famous, sought after, and it has to be said, one of the rarest adaptations is the Osborne and Gunby, and this is one of mine. I've owned several in my life, most of which I have sold on. This one is with me at the moment. Okay, so this is a trooper's version, and you can see it has a straighter blade than the standard 1796, although it still has some curve, and you will notice the point is very much akin to a falchion or langmesser. In other words, it has a clipped back point, not unlike a Bowie knife. Okay, that means that the point is now in line with the center of the blade, which helps with the stability of, once you enter the target, it's not going to push off in one direction or the other. So it's kind of like a spear point. It's like a falchion point or a Bowie knife point. So the point is in the center of the blade, but you still have a fair amount of width and mass for chopping and cutting. So this is a compromised blade. You'll notice it has almost a standard 1796 pattern hilt. Pretty much standard, actually. So this sort of conforms to 1796 light cavalry saber regulation, but sort of doesn't. And this was Osborne and Gunby were sword makers, and this was their attempt at creating, look, this is a new model of sword, same hilt as before, but a new type of blade, bit straighter, and a better thrusting point. And I would have said, this is a blade that you could have given to everybody in the 19th century, and it would have performed outstandingly well. I do not know why this was never adopted as regulation and why this style of blade didn't see further use. It has a fantastic thrusting point that's not going to over penetrate because you've got a nice small acute point that will penetrate here, and then it goes wider, which helps prevent over penetration past this point. But you've got weight and mass and breadth around here for really powerful cuts. So it's, to me, it's a fantastic compromise cut and thrust blade. And surprise, surprise, it's a type of blade that we find similar blades to this on various Middle Eastern swords. We find them on falchions, langmessers, used from the 14th century onwards. So this was historically a very successful style of blade, but for some reason it just wasn't commercially successful at the beginning of the 19th century in the Napoleonic era. I don't know why. They're certainly very popular and very sought after now, and it's a shame that they didn't stick around for longer. However, that also is not the sword that we're looking at in this video. What we're looking at here is a particular type of blade that I will call, you can call it by various names, but I think a lot of antique sword people would refer to this as a Prosser quill back or quill point blade. Okay, so here it is. Now you will notice it has an incredibly distinctive shape. We can dispense with the hilt straight away because the hilt is standard 1796 pattern style hilt with a sort of P-shaped knuckle bow. Okay, now there are two, you could say three unusual things actually about the blade. First of all, it is not as curved as a typical 1796. Okay, so it is a bit straighter. That's the first thing. The second thing is it's a pipe back. Okay, now a pipe back, or sometimes known as latchet section, or sometimes rod backed blade, is a type of blade that seems to have been inspired by Ottoman Turkish pala or kilic, and it's a type of blade that came into use in Britain and France, especially Austro-Hungary probably a bit, around the year 1800. Okay, so that by 1805, 1810, officers who had lots of money, and this is an officer's sword, officers that had lots of money would seek out the pipe back blade rather than a standard fullered blade. Okay, so the standard setup for 1796 is to have a broad fuller in the blade here. Now, we have talked about pipe backs in the past. I'm not going to go into any depth talking about pipe backs here. Why they were particularly popular at this time, what they were seen as being effective for, I don't really know. Overall, my impression is they tend not to be as durable as fullered blades, but you can get a very, very fine edge on them. But anyway, for whatever reason, pipe backs were popular at this time. So first of all, it's a bit straighter. Secondly, it's a pipe back blade. But the most important and interesting, and in some ways you could say weird and obscure aspect of this blade is this particular style of point, and it almost looks like a banana, doesn't it, in outline, or some kind of weird fish or sea mammal. Now, if you ignore this section, which we could refer to as a yeoman or false edge, okay, so you'll notice the rod section carries on in a straight line to the point. So if we just isolate that point for a second, the point itself actually is a spear point, and it actually literally looks like a spear point, like you might find on a Bronze Age spear. So we do have a spear point. Now clearly, as you might guess from the name, spear points are quite effective as points on weapons because they've been used on spears for thousands of years, all the way back to the Bronze Age, okay? So absolutely, that style of point, we know that's effective for stabbing because it's been used for thousands of years on things. So what they've done here is they've brought the gentle curve of the blade up to meet the rod section or pipe back section, but then to give it symmetry and give it this spear shape at the tip, they've created this flare here. Now this flare has a secondary, maybe even a tertiary purpose as well, that theoretically, and I know people are going to ask this, yes indeed, you can do false edge cuts with it, because notice you've got essentially a raised up bowed edge, and if you made this super sharp, this isn't sharpened, this one, but if you made that super sharp, it's going to have quite a good point of impact because it reduces the surface area that's in contact with the target. So indeed you could use this for manchette, as the French might call them, or wrist cuts with the back edge basically. Okay, so yes, you could use it for back edge cuts. I do not, however, think that's its primary purpose. Its primary purpose is to give symmetry and balance to the penetrating thrust. In other words, this is essentially a pipe-backed version of a 1796 saber that still has a lot of cutting potential and a lot of the advantages of a 1796, but has an improved point for penetrating the target. And remember that targets, clothing, uniforms, pelisses, all of this kind of stuff can sometimes be difficult to penetrate at the best of times, even with a good point. So it is really setting up to win the thrusting game. You could also additionally mention that this is partially inspired by the raised yeoman on the Ottoman Turkish pala or kilic, the style of sword used in Ottoman Turkey at the same time as this, that they would have come into contact with, particularly in the campaign in Egypt, where Napoleon and the British army were duking it out and Nelson as well, actually. It was the Battle of the Nile. Were duking it out in the beginning of the 1800s in Egypt. So absolutely they would have come into contact with particularly Ottoman Turkish swords there, and this may have inspired the pipe-backed blade. It may have inspired these raised yeomen. Now Prosser, who is Prosser? Prosser quite simply was a tailor, but Prosser of military clothing, uniforms. But Prosser also made some of the best, or procured some of the best quality swords in this period. So we often talk on this channel about Wilkinson sword, for example. Wilkinson sword weren't yet a thing. They hadn't been created. They were gun makers, actually, the Wilkinson family at this time. In the time of Napoleon, Prosser were the preeminent sword makers, along with a few others like Osborne and Gumby, but Prosser were really up there. And so this style of blade, although this one isn't actually named Prosser, it's actually named to another London maker, this style of blade is heavily associated with Prosser because many of them are made by Prosser. And so we're assuming that maybe Prosser came up with this particular blade design, although we're not certain of that. So this style of blade, I would say, is pretty damned unusual in the evolution of weapons, and therefore has earned its place in my obscure weapons category. It's a banana fish-like shaped point, but actually when you isolate it, it's really a way of fixing a spear tip on the end of a sword that's still set up for slashing, like a saber, and has a raised yeoman, potentially for back edge cuts, and importantly still leaves quite a lot of mass at the tip of the blade, which is one of the founding principles of the 1796 light cavalry saber. It still keeps quite a lot of mass at the tip of the blade, so if you do just want to hit someone really hard, you can still do it even with your sword that is still optimized for thrusting. So it doesn't mean that all thrusting swords have to be narrow like a rapier or an estoc. They don't have to be narrow and really pointy at the end. They can still be quite broad at the end and still have a decent point that's set up for the thrust. So there we go, the quill pointed or quill backed Prosser style saber, particularly famous of the British light cavalry in the last years, or last decade really, 1805 to 1815 of the Napoleonic Wars, and these were still being used up until the 1820s when they were replaced by other patterns that came into effect at that point. I hope this has been interesting. Check out my other videos in this playlist if you haven't done already. If you're not subscribed, please do. It makes a big difference to the channel. Leave a meaningful comment underneath if you've got any questions or suggestions for other obscure weapons that you'd like me to look at, ones that maybe you know about that I don't. Always happy to see your comments underneath my videos. I will see you down in the comments section. Thanks for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and I will continue to be so. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.